Welcome back to the studio. Today we have a really beautiful bright quilt to work on. This is a quilt done by a friend of mine, Marguerite Berry, and it's a real big one. It's a big one for me. It's 110 by 118, so we're going to be getting toward the outer limits of my frame size. This particular quilt is called Bordered Diamonds, and it comes out of a Kay Fawcett book called Simple Shapes and Spectacular Quilts. This particular quilt, let me see if I can see the page number. Nope, I can't see it without my glasses. And I hate wearing my glasses on camera. Page 116, called Bordered Diamonds. I believe it has templates, which most of Kay's patterns do, and as you can see, the quilt also is utilizing a huge selection of Kay fabrics. So I'm going to go ahead and load this on the frame. I don't have any idea yet which pattern I'm going to use. I have one in mind, but I'm not sure. I'm going to show you how the setup or the startup on the IQ works. We haven't shown that. I'm going to go ahead and get this large frame on both rollers. A quilt this size I like to have under even tension on all four sides. I'm going to also show you from the back of the machine some of my size constraints on the frame, because the IntelliQuilter motor does come off of the back right side of the carriage, so that takes up 4 or 5 inches of space that I have to deduct from my quilting. So this should be fun. I think actually it won't affect you, but it will me. I think I'm going to go ahead and get the quilt on, show you how the frame works with the IQ, get the quilt pattern selected, and we're going to save the quilt, and then tomorrow I'm going to come back out fresh and new, and I'm going to get started on the quilt. So we're actually going to save a whole quilt diagram after we program it, and then we'll come back out and start new tomorrow with the actual quilting. I believe I'm going to be using a rainbow variegated isocord thread on this. I have purple thread in the back on the bobbin. It's also isocord. It's also 40 weight. I'm going to keep that on there because the back looks like rows of corn, and it's in a purple color. So the back will be a solid purple, the front will be variegated, and we'll start with a new spool of thread and see how far we get. This is a pretty big quilt. So let's get moving to the next phase. I'm just going to show you what the setup is like on when you turn on the IQ. I'm going to go ahead and push the power button. I already have the Bernina Q24 powered up, and I have the motor also plugged in the back. I have those on a power strip, and I turn those off when I turn the IQ off, but it's all on a power strip. It's going through its setup screen right now. The machine is always going to ask to be brought to the very front of the machine and also to the center position. So just about now it's going to ask me to move the head of the machine, and it will start beeping. Move the machine to the middle of the table close to the front roller. So I hit OK. Now the IQ is ready to start programming for this particular quilt, but right now I'm just going to move it back out of the way and get my quilt loaded. We're on the back side of the Bernina Q24. You can see my carriage is moving forward and back, and on the carriage here I have my motor mount. This is the Y motor, and it doesn't really take up any space. It fits between the two carriage legs and rides on that track. Now here in the front is the X motor, and the X motor extends off to the right of the carriage, and it extends off about 5.5 inches. Now that 5.5 inches I really have to deduct from my maximum quilting size, because as you see when we get over to the frame, it's going to limit the movement of the frame, that 5.5 inches. So I have to deduct that from my total usable space. If I had the ruler base on, that also could affect the size that I'm able to do, because of the table would hit the clips that hold the side mount on the side tension grips on the backing and batting. Here you can see the mount for my laser disc, or my laser light. This is what I would use if I'm working from the back of the machine on a Panto, and that extends about 3.5, almost 4 inches on the left side of the frame. And I have to be careful of that, because that also can interrupt with the side of the frame, which does limit a little bit of the capacity, another 4 inches, for the amount of usable space I have. Now, I could take this off every time I'm not using it, and I may be doing that in the future, but I'm always worried about losing the screws and all the different pieces and having to put things back on and off all the time. But these are just two of the limitations, and if you include the ruler base, that's 3 different things that you have to consider when you're thinking about the maximum size of a quilt that you're able to do on a large frame. I was talking earlier about how much of the quilting frame I have access to with the sewing machine. One thing is that you can see this has a little bit of a curve to it, so that's why I extended the size of it, but that's a different topic. What I wanted to point out was this here is as far to my right as I can go right now. The head of the machine won't come any further because the motor for the IQ is on the side and would hit the frame. So I have marked on my leader, my take-up leader with the red magic marker, the very extent that I can actually sew with the head of the machine on the leader, so I know for future reference how big of a quilt I can sew. This is a good thing to do when you have the opportunity to do it. Sometimes I try and remember numbers, and I don't do so good remembering, but I'll always remember what this red mark is, and I could even say what it is. It's my edge limit. Now, it's not going to be exactly the same on the other side because I don't have a motor on the other side. So I could mark both sides of my leader, the actual extent that I can actually sew, and this is really helpful in the future when you're trying to determine what's the max you could do on a quilt. I'm going to go ahead and program the pattern that I picked out for this quilt. The name of the piecing pattern was Bordered Diamonds. It comes from a book of Kay Fawcett called Simple Shapes and Spectacular Quilts. As you can see, the majority of the fabrics are the Free Spirit Kay Fawcett fabrics, and they're collective. I'm going to start here with Design Sew Quilt. I'm going to start new. We have a work in progress. Do we want to replace it? Yes. It basically was me testing the steps. Do you want to erase it permanently or save it as a work in progress? I'm going to erase, and I'm going to reset the clock. We're going to do a pantograph today, and we're going to enter the rectangle manually because it's way too long for us to be able to mark it with the head of the machine. My actual quilt is 110 by 118. That was the measurement of this quilt off the frame, but I'm not going to use that measurement. I'm going to add a couple inches because it's going to be under tension on the frame, and so it could expand a little bit. So my width, instead of being 110, I think I'll do 112 and enter. And my length is 118. I think I'm going to go 122 on the length, and I can always snap to grid at the bottom to decrease that when I actually get down to the bottom. So I'm going to hit enter and continue, and we have our visual representation of the quilt on the screen. I'm going to hit finished, and now I'm going to load an Urban Elementz pattern for this quilt. I looked at several of them, and I decided I'm going to use Alouette. On my screen it says Alouette 9. The 9 is an indicator of what size this paper panto would have been. It's what size the designer was thinking of when they designed it. So I have a good idea of the way it should fill out. So I've selected that and I hit continue. That added it for the even rows. Now we're going to do it for the odd rows. Select it again, and we have the even and odd rows selected. And as you can see, there's some good white space in between all of these that I want to eliminate. That's called the gap. So I'm going to select gap. Right now it's at 0, and I'm just going to drag my mouse. Now I could hit the up and down button if I wanted to, but I like just dragging my finger or the cursor stick across the screen until it looks good, and I'm happy with that. So I'm going to go back and hit row height. Right now the row height says 12, but I remember that this was a 9-inch, so I'm going to go ahead and hit my keyboard, and I'm going to select 9 and enter. And that decreased the size of the rows and the pattern, and it added additional rows to compensate for it decreasing in size, and I'm very happy with the way that looks. My pattern density is right here, 7.73. This is something that you could use if you were factoring in different prices for long arming, because some customers want a loose density, some people want medium and full. That would be certainly something that you could adjust or use it as a rate scale for how much you charge. Obviously, the denser the stitching, the more thread it's going to use, both in the bobbin and in the top. So I'm going to go ahead and hit finished. It's updating the quilt. It's asking me what transition type I want. Now my 3 options are for it to do continuous sewing. When the design goes off of the edge of the quilt, it will just stitch down to the next start point and come back on. The other option would be jump stitches, or to stop and clip threads. I don't want to have to stop and clip threads every single time it goes off of the edge of the quilt, because I have the batting and backing there for it to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and keep the continuous, accept it, and this is now my finished quilt. If I were ready to start quilting, I could hit sew quilt, but first of all, I didn't program this at the upper left hand corner, so it wouldn't sew in the right place. But I can save the quilt pattern, and I want to save, rename the quilt. And what I'm going to do is name it for the quilt, the piecing pattern, which is a bordered diamond. So I'm going to spell out bordered diamond after I clear the unsaved name. So quilt name is B-O-A-R-D. I can't spell B-O-R-D-E-R-E-D space okay, it's spelled out bordered diamond, and I could write quilt also. Bordered diamond quilt, enter, and now it's saved in my work in progress, so I can go ahead and continue. When I want to work on this quilt, if I just select on the when I want to sew it, back at the main menu, I could design sew quilt and sew existing. And then I would go to work in progress. And right up here I have bordered diamond quilt. So I could go ahead and select that and continue. Here's my quilt. I can go ahead and select my start position in the morning, move the head of the machine to the start position, and it would be ready to sew. So this is how you would save a quilt in the program. It's all the measurements are already done. The only thing I'm going to do today before I shut down is to change the thread, so I have my variegated thread on ready for
When I first started
tomorrow.
using these Isacord threads,
So I can go
I
ahead
couldn't
and
figure
back out
out
of
why they
this,
made it so
and as you see,
difficult
I'm back to my
to
main
get
menu.
this plastic wrapping off. I was using scissors to try and cut it, to try and get underneath the plastic, and I was always clipping my threads. And then I realized all you have to do is pull up on it and the whole sleeve comes off. Whenever I'm going to change threads on the machine, I make sure that my hopping foot is up. I snip the thread at the top and pull the thread through the machine. The machine does not like to have the thread pulled backwards through the tension disc. So I can go ahead and pull off the purple spool that I was using. And I'm just going to find the edge. I don't know if I did a good job or a bad job of that. Okay, I made a little bit of a mess of that, but I'm just going to load this up just on one clip so that it lines up with my thread guide for the IntelliQuilter. I'm going to loop it through 2 of these tension discs on the IntelliQuilter. I like to make sure I'm not getting a knot in those. This usually goes a little bit faster when I'm not filming. Okay, so I've got it looped around twice on there, and this is my sensor wheel that indicates if the thread is broken, and I go around that twice, and you can see the little red arrow spinning as I'm pulling the thread through. Now I'm going to hold the thread, go through both of my tension hooks there. I'm going to hold this and go up under that, straight across, back around and down. Now I'm going to move to the other side. I always like to hold the thread as I'm doing that to make sure that it does go through the tension disc properly. I know my hopping foot is up. I go through that little take-up lever behind this flap, and now it's down to the 2 tension hooks here and into the eye of the needle. I think my machine does have a needle or a needle threader, but I don't use it. I'll use it when I'm old and gray. I don't use it now. And that's it for today. Tomorrow morning I'll come back out, we'll turn the machine back on, and we'll get our project started sewing with the Alouette pattern on the bordered diamond. Well, it's been a little bit longer than what I anticipated. I managed to get myself a head cold since I recorded the first part, so we have had about 3 or 4 days rest on the couch, but I feel like I've rallied enough today to come out and get at least half of this quilt done. So I'm going to turn on the machine. I already have the head on. The Bernina Q24 has been turned on, and now I'm turning on the tablet for the IQ. This is going to go through its opening process as you saw yesterday, and it's going to be asked to be brought to the front center of the machine again. That sounds like I just got an Amazon delivery. Packages still come even though I'm sick. And here we go. It will beep and beep and beep until you tell it that you brought it to the front center, which can be a little irritating. But now, before I do anything, I'm going to go back to my start position, because I want this quilt to start in the upper left-hand corner, and that's where I need it to open the program at. We are at the very end of that first partial row. Let me get my stylus so I can go ahead and sew. It's going to ask the next pattern that we're going to do, and I'm selecting the next row. I can swap my endpoint, so now it's starting on the right since we're already over here. And this is what would happen if we don't sequence the whole quilt. We'll be doing one row at a time, which may be fine for me because I don't know that I'm going to get all of this done today anyway. So I'm going to hit continue. We're going to do stop to cut threads and sew quilt. I needed to be at my start 2 point. Here we are at start 2. I'm going to hit OK. It's going to pull up my thread. You can see I have a couple extra inches on the side here because I want to make sure it was big enough. And I'm going to leave that for the time being. I basted my edge down. So now we're going to go across the first row. And this first row has 15 minutes of sew time. So I'm going to do a little pattern tracing for another project while this sews out. Okay, the third row is what I've selected that I want to quilt, but I need to roll the quilt up, and I know I need to roll it up because if I take the crosshairs, which I know is the needle position, and I try and go to the bottom of the next green line, I can't go all the way to the bottom because the head hits the front. So I know I don't have the room to sew that next row out. So what I'm going to do is choose an element at the very top of that row that I need to sew out and use that as my rolling up point. So I'm putting the eye of the needle there, drop the needle down. Now I'm going to release the tension and roll the quilt up, and then I can go ahead and realign.
I'm trying to realign. I'm going to hit realign. On the screen, there's very few points, and a point is what I want. I don't want a curve because it's less accurate. So on the line, the quilt line that I've already sewn, I'm going to choose a reference point that is an actual point. And I'm going to hit continue. Now it should go over to my row 3 starting point. I'm back. I hit the restart button. I'm going to go restart at row 3, my start 3 point. We're back on the left hand side, so we're going to sew left to right. Again, I'm sewing, my quilt design is much bigger than my quilt because I'm afraid there's a curve to it. And I want to make sure that I'm covering that curve before I clip it off. So we're off and running on row 3. Again, we have 15.9 minutes. So we'll have about 15 minutes of sewing, and then we'll see if I can be a little clear-headed about starting the 4th row. The one bad thing about seeing bright and beautiful quilts like this isn't mine, but it immediately makes me want to stop and pull out all of my cape fabrics and start doing this quilt. And I don't have any time to do that right now. But also maybe it's a good thing to get me motivated. And it is fun to work on beautiful quilts. For the most part, the IQ will tell you what it needs to know. And right now we're still in the design sew quilt, and my next choice is to sew quilt. It's saying touch a pattern to
to see its properties, but we don't need to see any properties. We just need to sew. It says select the next pattern to quilt, so I'll go ahead and choose row 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I have about 9 more after that. I'm going to try and get at least halfway done here. So I'm on the right hand side and my start point for 6 is on the left. So I'm going to swap, and now my start point for 6 is on the right hand side. So I'm going to go ahead and hit continue. I know that I need to stop and cut threads, and I would sew quilt. I'm going to have to hit sew quilt, and also I could hit Panto sequencing assistance and go ahead and do the rest of the rows, but I'm doing them individually because I know I'm going to quit halfway through. So I'm going to hit sew quilt and then stop, because I want to start row 6 on the right hand side, and so I need to restart it, but I also need to realign it because I'm going to need to roll up the quilt. So I'm going to hit realign, and row 6 is the bottom row. I'm going to pull the needle out of the machine, out of the quilt, and clip the threads. Choose a point on a row that's already been sewn out, and I'm going to choose one towards the center. I'm going to choose that one. And drop my needle. I'm now in the middle of the quilt. I have my needle dropped in my reference point, and I can go ahead and roll up the quilt. So I will just remove my tension from the sides. And I'm going to raise up my lower bar. That releases the tension. I'm going to release the tension on the bottom roller, and now advance the quilt. I don't need to go all the way to the back because this pattern doesn't require that big of a design space. So now I can just take a minute and make sure the batting is nice and flat. I can make sure that the quilt top lowers down nicely. And drop the bar down. A little bit of smoothing. I'm going to have to, well, I can go ahead and continue. I'm going to hit continue. My needle's still in the relocation spot, so I'm going to hit OK. And now I have to do an emergency stop. The IQ now knows where we are in the pattern and that I've advanced the quilt, so I can go ahead and hit the restart, because we can come back to row 6 and start on the left. But first I'm going to go to the right and baste the edge of the quilt, and then we'll get to our restart. After rebasting the edge, I'd already realigned, so now all I have left to do is hit the restart button and go to row 6. The little arrow will tell you which way it's going to start sewing. And as we know from earlier, I've made the quilt pattern much bigger than the actual quilt, so I have 1.5 inches at least off
off at the edge that it's not sewing, but that's why I basted the edge. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. My machine's in manual mode, and we'll get sewing. Again, this is row 6. I might do 1 or 2 more before I call it a day, because my head needs the couch. This is a really beautiful pattern, so I'm going to let it sew out for a little bit, but I'm going to try and turn down the volume. I have gotten a thread break detected notice, and you'll see here I'm stitching along, and all of a sudden my thread isn't broken, but there's on top, but there's nothing stitching in the bobbin. That just means that my bobbin ran out right there. Stitching, bobbin ran out, no stitching. So what I'm going to do is cut my top thread and pull the machine to the side and reload the bobbin, and this is right where I'll put my start again. A lot of times I'll just leave my scissors right here on the quilt pointing at the area where I need to restart, and that just helps me find it, especially on a multicolored quilt like this. It's so beautiful, but with the variegated thread and that multicolored fabric, very hard to find the start point. I'm eating a cookie. Right here's my restart place. I've already hit the restart button on the screen. So I'm just going to rethread the machine. Not because it was unthreaded, but because I just unthreaded it.
I'm going to bring my needle back to where it stopped sewing. Actually, it's maybe, well, you can see how far. A little bit before where it stopped sewing. And now I'm going to hit the restart button. And the program knows that it needs to pick up sewing there. So I'm going to go ahead and hit start. Flip my threads. And you'll never be able to notice where the thread ran out. I have finished 8 rows. Let's see what I have left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I have 7 rows left, and I'm going to quit for the night. So I'm just going to hit the back button. I made myself a note that I have completed row 8. I have a backup of this quilt saved on the computer in my backup file. So I'm just going to hit the back button. Do I want to save current needle position? I'll say yes. And now I'm going to hit the back button and the back button. I'm back to my main menu. I can go ahead and shut my system down. And in the morning we'll go ahead and restart it again. I'm really doing double duty today. I just shot our year in review video, and I need to get the camera off and onto the computer so I can start processing that. But I wanted to finish at least getting the programming done for the last half of this quilt. So I'm going to open it up again, and we're going to move down to row 8 from our saved quilt project, and then I'm going to go ahead and try and sequence the whole rest of the quilt for quilting, and then I can get the video processing, and then I'll bring it back and show you the finished quilt. So we're here in the front of the machine again, and I'm going to hit design sew, edit existing, our work in progress, continue. We're saving a backup, and this is our quilt as we brought it in. Now we have all of our start points, and so all I need to do is go to a reference point on the screen and touch that. So I will take my stylus and choose a pattern in the quilt. I know I'm in the center of the quilt, and I'm on row 8. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I've touched my reference point. I've got my needle hovering over it. I'm going to select OK. So now it knows where I am. I'm going to hit Sew Quilt. It already knows that I've sewn all of those rows, and I'm going to go ahead and get ready to sew the quilt. But I need to advance the quilt, so I've got myself back to where I need to be. I'm going to advance the quilt and readjust one more time, and then restart and get stitching again. I'm going to get the camera off so I can get it processing what I have on the video already. And then we'll bring you back in, and we'll finish up this video as I finish up that video. And this is what craziness looks like in the studio. I had finished all of the quilting for this large quilt, and during the interim I was on the phone with Patricia from Urban Elements, and I was corrected on something that I've been making a mistake on all along. As many of you know, I just got the IntelliQuilter system sometime this year. I think it was like April. So I've been learning the process of using it. I got my IntelliQuilter secondhand, so I didn't get in-person classes, and I've been learning as I go. And I've been making a notable mistake, and I'm going to show you what that mistake is. I'm going to go ahead and load a imaginary quilt on here. So we're going to design, sew, start new. We're going to erase work in progress. This is going to be a pantograph quilt, and we're going to enter rectangle manually. This is all imaginary, so it doesn't matter what size I put, but I'm going to put 80 by 100 and continue. So we have our imaginary quilt, and I'm going to go ahead and hit finished, and now we're going to load our design, and I'm going to use the design that I just used today as my example. And the design is Alouette, and it was a 9-inch design. I know that because I looked that up on the website and I input that information. So I'm going to select Alouette for the even and odd rows, and this is the part that I was wrong about. There's two things here. Well, first we could do the gap. I'm going to go ahead and do that as I normally would. It doesn't have to be as precise. That's how I would fill in my gap. And then I would go to row height, and there's two things that are here on this one button: row height and pattern height. The row height says 12 inches, and that's what I was adjusting. And the pattern height right now says 16.666 inches. So I was adjusting the row height by using the calculator and adjusting that down to 9 inches. And what I was getting is the row height was 9 inches, and I still don't know what row height means, but the pattern height is 12.5 inches. So the original design was intended to be 9 inches. I have it at 12.5. That's 3.5 inches bigger than it was intended. So I'm still going to do a little bit of research so that the next time I can talk on this more correctly. But in order to adjust the pattern height, you just have to keep going down in size. I don't know the metric yet for how to do it, but in order to adjust the pattern height, you can only adjust the row height. There's no direct way to input a size for the pattern height as far as I know. So this is the closest I can get. 8.979 inches pattern height. The Alouette was originally 9 inches, so we're just a fraction off of that. But my row height is now 6.46. So that shows you what a vast difference. So this particular quilt, which had 12 rows, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, should have had 16 rows. So you could see that I've really exaggerated the size of this panto on this quilt. It doesn't bother me on this particular quilt because I still think the panto looked beautiful. But it is a correction that I need to make in the future. It shows you how the pattern should sew out, and the pattern density now on here is 1.19. I wonder if I increase it, what I have to increase it to. Well, now I'd have to decrease it to get it to a 1.0. No. So for pattern density, I don't know if that comes into play with the exact size it was designed at. That would bring the pattern height to 10.5 inches, 10.64. But now I know it's the pattern height that I'm trying to match to the actual size description on the urban site, so that I know what the Panto was designed for. So it's not that I love making mistakes, but it's only in making mistakes that you learn. And I've just learned a new component of the system, and I'm happy I learned it, and so I'm happy to share that with you. Other than that, I'm finished with this particular quilt. Usually I will take it off the frame and give you an overall view, but because the thread match is so good, it's not going to be a real visual stunner to do that, and I also have to get rolling. In my time, it's New Year's Eve, so I've got 2 videos to process tonight, and so I'm going to go ahead and shut this down and get moving. I hope you all have a great new year, and I know that you won't all see this on New Year's, so I'll take that with a grain of salt. But thanks for joining us today. Until next time, we'll see you back in the studio.